I'm John Lordan.
I'm Gray Hughes.
And I'm Mike Morford.
And we are still Three Men and a Mystery. In late 2018, Gray Hughes, Mike Morford, and myself started a project called 3 Men and a Mystery. The concept was that we would do a very deep dive on one case per season and release both YouTube and podcast versions of each episode, as well as do some special live streams. For season 1, we chose to cover the murders of J.B. Beasley and Tracy Hollett out in Ozark, Alabama.
The girls were together driving home, trying to find the location of a party that was for JB's 17th birthday, but they wound up getting lost. Stopping at a gas station, they asked a woman and her daughter for directions, and Tracy called her mom and let her know she would be home past curfew. The next morning, they would be found dead, both shot and left in the trunk of JB's Mazda 929.
We found out that a DNA sample was available and knew that genetic genealogy would help progress this case. We were planning on contacting law enforcement and offering to help cover the cost of that effort.
But as we frequently run into, law enforcement was not easy to engage with. I hoped that if we had started releasing the episodes that they would see the care that we were putting into the story and hopefully would feel comfortable eventually speaking with us. Several months later, we started recording the episodes, and in early 2019, there was an announcement.
Law enforcement used Parabon Nanolabs to analyze the DNA sample, and they found it came from a man named Coley McCraney. By all appearances, he's a family man and has no real criminal record. He works as a truck driver and has remained living in the area this whole time.
But there was a question about the DNA. It only proved there was some form of sexual contact between McCraney and J.B. Beasley. It wasn't from a murder weapon, and that weapon has never been found. Would this be enough to not only charge a man for murder, but bring in a successful conviction?
Now, we haven't seen a lot of these genetic genealogy cases go to a full-blown trial. And despite McCraney being arrested and charged in March of 2019, we would have to wait several years. The trial has now concluded, and we have a verdict. We've also learned information about that night that the public has never heard of before. We thought it was time for a little 3 Men and a Mystery reunion to add a final episode to season 1 4 years later. This is the trial of Coley McCraney. Now, do you guys recall back at the end of season 1 how you felt about McCraney and the possibility of him being guilty?
I remember thinking that it was unreasonable to believe that the DNA was put there any other way than him being the killer. The circumstances of that evening didn't match up with that happening, so it seemed to me like it was really clear that he was going to be the killer.
Well, that's what I was always wondering about, was the possibility that there was other circumstances about that evening that we didn't know about. These two girls are out driving around. Could she have known McCraney and stopped at his house at some point earlier? They had some sexual encounter, maybe even earlier that day. That's why I've been kind of holding off. I've really been split down the line on this. What about you, Morph? Do you remember at the end of season 1 which way you were leaning with this?
Well, it's funny. It was genealogy solving these cases was still rather new because the Golden State Killer case had just gotten solved the year before. So it was still new to people, but I had a really good grasp of it because I had done so much work with the Golden State Killer case that I knew a lot about the way the process works, the genealogy process. So I felt when they linked his DNA back to him, when they verified that this was his DNA, he was going to have some explaining to do, whether that was, okay, we had a relationship, blah, 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 or the other option was he was the killer. There was no real in between for me. The fact that he didn't come forward sooner, as far as we know, I've heard some rumors that maybe he did early on, but that was going to be a problem, an uphill battle. And, here it is. It seems to be the case.
Yeah. So Coley McCraney gets charged with capital murder and rape. He's been incarcerated since March of 2019, and he's facing the death penalty. Alabama Attorney General Steve Marshall and Assistant Attorney General Jimmy Thomas prosecuted McCraney due to the previous district attorney that was working on the case being in a bicycle accident. Other members of the Dale County DA's office did also assist. Now, they tried to get this trial going back in August of 2022, but it was delayed when they couldn't pull a jury together out of only 75 people that showed up to serve at that time. So they waited, they kind of re-rallied. I don't know why it worked better this time, but it seems to have. In April of 2023, they called in 300 jurors. 150 of them were dropped by prosecutors, like right off the bat. And then another 50 decided not to come back the next day when they were still being processed to see if they were going to be part of the jury or not. This left them with about 100 people. Was that going to be enough to get the trial finally going? Well, they made their selections, but they hit one more minor setback. On the day that the trial was supposed to start, one of the selected jurors didn't show up. Did you guys know about this? I mean, there's so much drama.
I read about that. I think he got arrested too, didn't he?
Yeah. Deputies basically went to his place of employment. They brought him back to Ozark, but it wasn't to make him serve on the jury. He was dismissed from the case, and he was arrested for an unrelated warrant. So he had some kind of other warrant, active warrant. Maybe he was feeling weird about being at the courthouse just to start with. And
didn't you think that was pretty odd? Because I remember reading that thinking, how did he make it onto the jury with an active warrant?
Yeah. I guess there's no check. Is there no check that happens there?
That's bizarre, right? I mean,
yeah. So
how would that affect the jury, having somebody that's got an open warrant serving on the jury had he shown up?
Depends what the warrant's for. I think it's for a traffic thing. I don't think it's like a major warrant, but yeah. So they did have to roll in one of the alternates to take his place, but they finally had it. The trial was finally happening. Would we find justice for JB and Tracy? Would McCraney take the stand? Now, in opening statements, Assistant District Attorney Emmett Massey took the floor first, and he asked the jury to remember what it was like being a teenager and wanting to be out with your friends late at night. Massey then stated what they believed and were trying to prove had happened, that the girls were held at gunpoint and taken from the Big Little gas station to a spot where one of them was raped, and then they were both shot at point blank range in Beasley's trunk. Big Little gas station coming up in this story again. It was just a centerpiece when we were going through trying to figure this all out the first time around, because it's one of the locations where we know the girls were. There was a phone call that happened from there. There was witnesses that had seen them there. Of course, all that's going to come into play as we keep rolling forward here. As a matter of fact, listeners of the original season of 3 Men and a Mystery might recall that there was a witness who saw the girls at the gas station and witnessed them leaving the gas station, heading towards the highway. Her name was Marilyn Merritt, and her daughter was with her. We now know that her daughter's name is Mariel Clark. They had given the girls directions, but on the stand in the trial, Mariel and her mother are now saying that they didn't watch the girls leave, that they actually left before the girls, only after hearing that the girls had connected with someone on the phone. So that was kind of a big change from the information we had before. And it changes things pretty dramatically, because we think the girls leave this scene and they're at least safe at that point, and that moves where our focus should be. But once we get
that's why we had that whole conversation about that crazy signage.
Yes,
because we figured they made it that direction, but man, look at that sign, 921, all these different numbers. I don't know if that was the actual number, but which way to turn, and that's what led to that, because we thought they had left and it was a short drive to get to that intersection.
If I remember right, I think it was like Highway 231 and Highway 123, and it was just like the same.
Exactly.
Yeah, really easy to confuse.
Yeah. Didn't we have a witness that reported seeing a black truck following closely behind what they thought was their car at a certain point? I think that
we did
swayed a little bit.
Yeah, I had to go kind of through all the materials again. I did this piece for the local news out there. They made this little mini documentary about the case, and I re-listened to that stuff, and I'm really surprised. Like, none of that comes up. There's some other testimony about someone that saw possibly a truck that was following the girls, but it doesn't match the description of the truck that we had. In this trial, the person says it was either white or it was very light tan truck, like an F-150. And we had always heard about a dark truck and a white Mustang that were kind of surrounding the car. None of that comes up in this.
Also, do you remember that secondary location? Remember that? We found that weird broken down barn.
Yeah.
I don't know if we're going to be talking about that, but it was crazy because they mentioned something like that in this trial, and it's on that same little side road.
Yeah. Yeah.
As that barn. It's unbelievable.
I heard a little piece in the trial where one of the experts was talking about the 9mm shell casing that was found at that location. And that I believe it does match the shell casing. I think it was probably ejection mark analysis.
I see.
That was found in the trunk. So, but it's weird because like in all the wrap ups that I've heard about this case, that location isn't really being strongly noted as, yep, we know where he took them. It was over here.
Yeah. Because where's the swamp?
Yeah. Yeah.
It's exactly. Not right next. There's nothing right next to that barn.
Right. Right. So, let's see here. The assistant DA continued his opening statement saying that Coley McCraney encountered the girls at the gas station. Massey also hammered in his point saying, let the DNA do the talking, let the mud do the talking. So I was kind of interested in that. Let the mud do the talking. Now, as the trial progressed, it kind of came out that we know that there was mud that was on the girls, as Gray was just mentioning. Some of the mud wound up on the inside leg of JB's pants. And they're saying that that's proof that she was sexually assaulted. Basically, they were out in some marshy or muddy area and her pants were taken down, and that's how the inside got mud on them. I don't know if they're noticing a difference between Tracy's and JB's. Like if that didn't happen with Tracy, did they see that the mud was only on the outside? But just being on the mud being found on the inside of her legs of her pants, basically they're saying that's signs that she was assaulted. In their opening statements, the defense, of course, says that the events that took place were different than the prosecution alleges, but there's something that both sides actually agree on. The defense says that McCraney was having car trouble and he stopped at the Big Little gas station where the girls were on the night of July 31st, 1999. But according to the defense, a then 23-year-old McCraney overheard the two women talking about being lost and he offered to help them. They're saying he got into the car with the girls and they drove around talking before he and Beasley eventually had sex. The defense even made reference to McCraney being a player. But to get into a car with two girls that you just met and have a sexual encounter after just driving around for a bit, on top of that, one of the girls has a curfew. Are you guys finding any of that reasonable or believable?
No. And how? And we got to point out, how old are the girls again?
17.
Getting in the yeah. So I don't know what the age of consent is in Alabama, but I mean, you got a 23-year-old man and underage girls.
Yeah.
Not a good recipe for stuff.
Yeah, and they were late getting home. I mean, that's something we've known, that they called home to, I think it was it Tracy's mother? I think?
Carol Roberts. Yep.
Yeah, and she said, hey, we're running late. And the mom didn't really say, oh, you can stay out a long time. She wanted him home right now. And then they asked for directions. I mean, they did ask if they could stay a little longer, I guess, but the mother wasn't allowing that. And then, you sort of wonder, what was Coley doing there?
Right.
I mean, was he just waiting? Happened to be going to the store? I mean, what was he doing?
Supposedly, his vehicle gave him trouble and he got stuck there. But there's honestly even a bigger problem in this whole version of the story. When McCraney was initially questioned by the investigators, he denied knowing the girls at all. That's a problem. Now, admittedly, he was dating a woman that he is actually married to now. And I know back when we were originally working on this, Morph, you kept bringing up maybe he had to respond that way because he didn't want his wife to find out that, he was out with these girls. It's a possibility. Yeah,
sometimes people lie, and it's not always because they are guilty of murder. It's because they don't want their other secrets to come out, like cheating with an underage girl. I mean,
right.
Things like that. So it's not always because they're covering up a murder.
But there's this other aspect to it that kind of bothers me. If he is truly innocent, and that is literally what happened, that would mean that he had details that could have helped a 2-decade-old police investigation that literally gripped his entire local community that he never provided. He would have known where the girls were and what time they dropped him off. And that would have, like the timeline we were putting together, that would have added a different point of interest. Okay, now we know they went from there, they wound up over on this street, and that's where they were last seen. So I'm just kind of curious, like, how do you, I mean, yes, you don't want your wife to find out about it. Couldn't you have called in an anonymous tip or something? Hey, I know where the girls were at this particular time. I don't know. It seems a little strange. The defense also mentioned in their opening statements that a paperboy saw Beasley's car in 2 locations in the early morning hours of August 1st, 1999, and he says that he saw an unmarked Ozark police car at the scene before the police were ever called. Now, defense attorney David Harrison said that the paperboy gave that statement 2 decades ago, but that statement has apparently disappeared from the police file, and that paperboy is going to be brought to the stand in this trial. In Harrison's words, quote, "The paperboy is going to do what he did back then. Tell the news." In case you guys don't know much about David Harrison, he really has a touch for the dramatic in his delivery on some of this stuff. Some police involvement and cover-up has long been rumored in this case, and it seems that the defense might be trying to use that to introduce some level of reasonable doubt. As a matter of fact, some of these rumors are so strong that we just heard about them again a few months ago, right, Mike?
Yeah, this was a case where a lot of people were reaching out, with the trial coming and saying, "Hey, I heard this," or, "Did you know about that?" Or a lot of people voicing their support for Coley McCraney too. So people hadn't forgotten that we covered this case, because we had a lot of people reaching out and giving us tidbits, some of the things we had heard before and some of the things were sort of new.
Yeah. And in particular, we had heard about Rena Crum, who was someone that said law enforcement had made an admission to doing this at some point that she overheard. They actually did in pretrial motions. They brought that information up, and Rena basically says, "Nope, I was lying about that the whole time." So that was not allowed in trial here. Harrison also had a strong point that he wanted to make with the jury, and he repeated it several times: do not assume. As telling as the prosecutor saying, "Let the DNA do the talking," I believe the defense is going to ask the jury to consider that McCraney might have had a sexual encounter with JB, then left the girls, and then something happened to them after. Harrison also had a strong point that he wanted to make with the jury, and he apparently repeated this many times: do not assume. As telling as the prosecutor saying, "Let the DNA do the talking," I believe the defense is going to ask the jury to consider that McCraney might have had a sexual encounter with JB, then left the girls, and something happened to them after that. So witness testimony began. Family members spoke of the tragedy. Carol Roberts, Tracy's mother, confirmed the phone call that they had when the girls were at the Big Little station. And when questioned about extending Tracy's curfew, she claimed that it didn't quite happen like that. She didn't extend her curfew, but she did agree that Tracy could meet up with a few friends of theirs for 5 minutes at a different gas station in Midland City before heading home. They then brought up Wade Williams, who was kind of a on-again, off-again boyfriend of Tracy, and he was called to the stand saying that he received a call from Beasley and Hollett from an Ozark gas station, and the girls asked if they wanted to all meet up at the Midland City gas station around 11:15. Everyone agreed to this, but JB and Tracy never showed up at the meeting spot. The boys there waited for approximately 30 minutes, and then they left. So it seems like the girls got derailed before they could go to this meeting that they had set up, kind of got approval from Tracy's mother for, and they had boys they were going to see. Just, it's kind of, in terms of a story of Coley, like, "Oh, I met these 2 girls. I got in their car. One of them had sex with me." It's kind of looking strange.
Don't you think it's amazing how many cases are like this, where something didn't happen the way it was supposed to, and then it leads to a murder?
Yeah.
And it's just unbelievable. Like,
it also gives us a nice timeline of, okay, they're supposed to be here at X time, they're last seen here at X time, so we can assume that whatever happened to them happened in this very small window. And to your point, John, the story that, "Hey, we're going to meet our friends at this gas station, but I'm going to meet this guy and just randomly have sex with him on the way," it just doesn't sound realistic to me.
Well, the thing that I was thinking about, I actually thought of almost exactly the same thing. I said, what was Tracy doing during the time that JB and Coley are having sex?
Right.
Right?
Yeah. Is she just driving? Is she driving the car or sitting somewhere? Like, yeah, what friend would do that to another friend? Hey, wait while I go do this, and I'll be right back. I mean, I don't, especially knowing that the other friend has a curfew, you know.
Right, and in either scenario. So let's say she was assaulted.
Yeah.
I mean, I think, well, she was assaulted, but like, how do we, like, what was Tracy doing during that time? What was she doing?
Right.
That's pretty wild to think about. Like, how, I mean, that's where you get to the conspiracy that there might be more than one person.
Right. Now, in terms of the DNA, we had previously been told that it was from semen found on JB's bra and sweater. And we do know that that's a match for Coley McCraney. However, there's a new detail that started coming out in trial, and it's honestly one that I'm still, even though the trial has concluded at this point, I'm still not understanding very well. Despite it being previously reported that the girls were both virgins based on a medical analysis of their bodies, there is now mention of a vaginal swab that was taken from JB, and some of the statements from the expert witnesses is making it sound like DNA might have been found there as well. The thing that's throwing me about this is I recall Chief Spivey saying initially that there was no sexual assault. It was part of the whole thing about this case. Like, we didn't understand what the motive was if there was no sexual assault. I even remember us having conversations about, well, when they do eventually find the semen on the bra and the sweater, that all of a sudden it makes sense. Now we know that it is a sexual assault. Just because the girls happen to both be virgins doesn't mean that they weren't sexually assaulted. But now we're hearing it's very different. Where this is an interesting wrinkle, and this is kind of a side branch to this whole story. If they had DNA from a sexual assault kit, I would think that they probably knew that from the start. And why did Johnny Barentine get arrested at all? Like, you know, they had a sample. They ran sexual assault kits. They would have known that. It's weird because later expert analysis makes it sound like the DNA from the sexual assault kit might not be as detailed and might have been a mixed profile that contained both JB and McCraney's DNA, obviously. I think there might be something about that level of DNA where they can test against it and say this person might be a contributor, but it's not like a one-to-one match. Do you have any insight on that, Morph?
Yeah, I mean, and we're going back, 20 years to the DNA analysis, examination, science is leaps and bounds higher, better today than it was back then. So I don't know how much effort was put into seeing what could be done with the DNA. What if they sent this to the state level to have work done, if they tried to do it there locally. That's the thing that I'd be curious about, how much work was done with that DNA. But it may have been enough where at the time they just said, okay, we can tell this person did contribute. But they were far enough along, you would think, as you mentioned, that if it didn't match Johnny Barentine, if they tested Johnny Barentine, he should have been dismissed pretty quickly.
Well, and that's kind of what does eventually happen. And I remember when all of a sudden Spivey heard about this DNA sample from the sweater, he's like, oh, they dropped this on me now. And then they used that to rule out Johnny Barentine. So it's just weird to me that there's this other sample that they probably would have known from their initial crime scene investigation that just kind of disappeared. Or maybe the chief had just not heard about it. I don't know. It's just a weird side note in all this. But
it sounds like they deployed some of the more recent techniques in extracting DNA from items.
Yeah.
So maybe they were able to even dial it closer into the sexual assault of JB even further, maybe tested underwear again. So I think they did mention that at the trial, didn't they? Where they
did, but when they needed one-to-one analysis, they kept going back to the sweater sample. And I was curious about it because I wanted to make sure it wasn't some form of like, are they trying to make this seem like it was an even worse sexual assault? Like all of a sudden now there's, proof of penetration or something like that. But it doesn't sound like it. Just sounds like the DNA sample was not as usable as, because it was a mixed profile possibly, as the sample that was on her sweater.
Well, that might be the actual answer to your question then, because it's very hard to extract if it's equal mix. It's hard to get a profile off of that sample. Yeah. It didn't exclude him though when they compared it against McCraney, and then thus the semen on the sweater. With that, it tells a story.
Yeah.
If it's 20 years ago that they're trying to do all that.
Oh, yeah. That's a really interesting thing about this case is just, it's one of those that was just on the fringe of like, hey, we knew DNA then, we were doing one-to-one analysis, but there's just no connectivity between McCraney and these victims. Like it's without this DNA, this guy is not sitting in this courtroom. So it's obviously a big factor.
And that's what makes crimes hard to solve. If you don't usually have a connection between them, if it's just a 100% random victim, it makes these cases harder to solve. And that's why it's important to have the DNA when there is DNA to use that to your advantage.
Yeah. I mean, if we are to believe that he's guilty, this is crime of opportunity, right? Like he just doesn't, maybe he saw these girls around town before, maybe not. He just showed up at that place at that time. And this is what he did. But so on the second day of witness testimony, the families actually left the courtroom and forensic pathologists took the stand, going into details of the wounds on both girls, showing some photos to the jury of those. Retired forensic pathologist Gregory Wagner was called to the stand. He had performed both autopsies. He reviewed his findings with the courtroom. Pretty straightforward, gunshot deaths here. Some of the girls' clothing was shown to the jury. He also shared that no drugs or alcohol were found in their systems. He also touched on the sexual assault kit, and he testified that you can have consensual or non-consensual intercourse. Both can produce or not produce injuries. There were no injuries in this case. And defense attorney Harrison told him, the evidence you're given to the jury today is what happened and not who done it. So I think it's important because he was trying to point out that this could have still been a sexual assault just because we didn't see trauma that would tell us it was necessarily a sexual assault. It still could have been one. With every expert witness, the defense kept asking the same question: does this prove McCraney killed the girls? And each expert witness agreed that their information alone did not. Other clarifications were made. The palm print you guys might remember us talking about. There was a palm print found on the trunk. Seems like that actually came from a police officer. The ID on the dashboard, you might remember we thought someone faked the girls out into thinking they were the cops, and that's how they pulled them over because the ID was on the dashboard. That was done by a police officer who had found JB's purse wedged between the seats, pulled it out, found her ID, and then was using that to help figure out who the car belonged to. There was blood that seeped out of the trunk and onto the wheel, and because it flung up into the wheel well, they could then conclude that at least one of the girls' bodies was in the trunk and then the car was moved. Basically, the inside of the wheel well had blood flung up into it.
I was thinking about that earlier, man. If one of them had to drive and was still alive, what a nightmare, because they already knew that their friend was killed. And then...
Yeah, I was kind of thinking about that too. I mean, one of the things we always struggled with is two victims. Like if you're one person trying to handle two victims, what are you going to do? And I'm still of the mind that there was a possibility that one of the girls could have been killed separately, so that he wouldn't have to worry about that. But according to what the prosecution's putting out here, they think that both girls were basically shot at the same location and then put into the trunk, and then the car's driven after that. So,
I mean, if someone's holding a gun on both of them, I could see them cooperating. I mean, if they're right next to each other and there's one person with a gun, it's pretty easy to control both people. And then
but while a sexual assault is taking place,
well, that's another issue. Is the other person just going to wait around while that's happening? So that is a troubling part of the case. But definitely some questions still.
I thought they were saying that they were both shot while in the trunk.
They did say that also. Yeah.
And that was one thing we had talked about because we had wondered, was there a bullet hole in the trunk that they could see had pierced the bottom of the trunk, and that's how they knew they were shot in the trunk?
They do mention, I think there is one, they actually mentioned two spots in the trunk, if I remember right, that I believe had been damaged. So yeah.
And I still at the end of the day, I don't want to give any spoilers here about where we wind up here at the end of this episode, but I still wonder why all this stuff was necessary. The moving, the putting them in the trunk, the shuffling them around. Um, it's not like they hid their bodies and drove the car into a river and hope it would sunk there and never be found. These were going to be found. So I don't understand the whole process of moving the bodies, putting them in the trunk, moving the car around, unless maybe, sometimes you have a plan and it goes awry. Maybe he was thinking, okay, I've got to get rid of these bodies. I'm going to dispose of them, and then got interrupted somehow. I just, the whole moving of the bodies and all that,
Yeah.
it seems like
Could
a
be
weird...
laziness, right? Like he put him in the car, but then he drives in a place where he doesn't have to walk that far to get back to his house.
We had
But
talked
still,
about
why-
that. Yeah, we had talked about that for sure. Like, was there
Why move them at all, though? Why not just leave them out in the woods and
leave that scene there?
The whole, yeah, exactly. Let the elements take care of it. Hopefully, the rain,
Oh, I see.
whatever. I just don't understand the whole moving. That's something that's always stuck with me. That
Well, some criminals are just dumb.
Yeah, and it's a good thing that they are, but
Yeah.
there had to be a reason in their mind at the point they were doing this as to why they were doing this. And it wasn't hiding the bodies because they weren't really hidden, besides being...
Yeah, I mean, I see what you're saying. Like, why not leave their bodies in the woods, then drive the car where it was found and just get out and walk home, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Two different locations. It's harder to find the bodies. It buys you time until the bodies are found. By then, hopefully, the elements, animals, whatever, will get rid of the evidence. I just don't understand the whole moving of the bodies, and that's always been a sticking point with me about this case as to why that was all being done.
Yeah, well, you either have to believe that this is a person that is not very experienced in terms of what they're doing, or this is someone that's kind of a genius. Because on the flip side, the actual location that the girls might have been attacked at wouldn't be found for a long period of time. Like they were trying to trace the mud. I remember that they went and looked at the ready ice. I think that was down the street from there because it was an ice plant and there was all kinds of moisture that was going to be around there. But it's a weird thing to think of, and even trying to apply that to Coley. This dude is 24 years old. Is he a criminal mastermind at this point that's able to pull this kind of thing off and get away with it for 20 years? I don't know.
There's quite a few,
and then never do it again, as far as we know. So
right, and become a part-time pastor, and
Well, that kind of behavior though makes you wonder if they're someone on my channel mentioning that he's a trucker. Who the hell knows what he was doing out there?
Oh, that's a good.
I mean, that kind of behavior, doing that's pretty like something that somebody would repeat.
Yeah.
I can tell you this, that in a majority of these cases that are being solved with genealogy, overwhelmingly, the person that commits the crime isn't a serial killer. They're a one-off killer. They do this thing one time and never do it again for whatever reason. That's the case on the bulk of these. That's how they went.
Yeah.
That is pretty interesting.
McCraney's fingerprints were not found on the steering wheel, trunk, or rear view mirror. But investigators believe that the killer drove the vehicle after shooting the teens. They did note that there was mud on the driver's side floorboard. Also, the rearview mirror had apparently been knocked out of position. And one of the experts said that might show that there was some kind of struggle that actually happened inside the vehicle. Now, I've been in contact with two people that were in the courtroom, WTVY reporter Ken Curtis and a citizen that attended the entire trial. We'll refer to him as Historiented from now on. Ken tells me that the strongest moment for the defense was when investigators testified they had nothing to link McCraney to the Mazda 929. However, Historiented noted that the defense now stating that Coley was in the car, that's part of Coley's story now. I actually got into this car with them, that it basically nullified that point. You have the experts saying, no, we don't have Coley's fingerprints. We don't have anything to prove he was in there, but we know he was in there. He's saying he was in there. So just kind of.
But also his DNA is also on JB, and that's in the car.
Yeah.
Right. So that
to expand. Were there any fingerprints found in the car, or was the car wiped clean?
That's another good possibility to think of. Yeah. Did he wipe down the car? There were some fingerprints found, but based on what I heard, everything that was found was attributed to police.
Yeah, but by the flip side, though, if there's no prints at all besides the police officers in that car, that would be pretty eye-opening.
Yeah, I don't know if they did that deep, because the way they asked it, they were kind of asking specifically if his prints were found. That's a good point. Former Ozark Police Chief Marlos Walker took the stand. He was questioned about McCraney's interrogation. Basically, they kind of ran down that. We talked about this in the early episodes. They kept McCraney for 25 hours. He was fed. They were asking if they kept the lights on in the room that he was in. Basically, they said McCraney could have walked over to the wall and hit the switch off. The biggest takeaway from all this is when the defense asked if Walker had any eyewitnesses that said McCraney killed these girls. And Walker said no. The only evidence he has to implicate McCraney is DNA. After him, they brought up McCraney's former landlord, who testified that the rental property that McCraney was living in, half a mile from the gas station where the girls were. Deputy Chief Michael Bryan showed a map detailing from where the car was left to McCraney's home, 0.7 miles. So less than a mile, basically, if you make a triangle there, all this is within a mile. I know when we originally looked at this case, we always thought that the location of the car had to be close to either where the suspect had another vehicle, could get away, or someplace where they might be staying. Or there was a possibility that there was more than one person. Another car followed along. They jumped into the same car and then took off from there. But in terms of McCraney, this would have been a good location for him to take that car, leave it, and, you know, if he hoofs it, he's home within 10 minutes. McCraney's wife, Jeanette, took the stand. Mrs. McCraney said that she got home around 8 p.m. that night. McCraney came home shortly after. He then left to go back out to his parents' house around 10 p.m., and then he got back home again around 12:45 a.m. McCraney told her that his car had broken down at the Big Little store, so he had walked home. She went with him to the car at the Big Little store that night, and they were able to fix the car. I think it just needed to be jumped, and then return home. She also said that McCraney looked the same as when he left when he came home, that basically he was clean. An employee...
Did she say anything, not to interrupt, but she say anything about his demeanor, his attitude, how he was acting?
I didn't see anything on that. Gray, did you see anything on?
No, but I think there was something about his appearance, what he was wearing, and she had apparently, I was reading the closing arguments, that it was really specific, really amazing memory for something that happened so long ago.
Yeah. I mean, I don't remember what I was wearing 20 years ago. I couldn't even remember.
I mean, it was interesting how she didn't really, she couldn't make an alibi like, oh man, he was home at 10 and never left, right? Because he's already said, everybody's already known that he says he had sex with JV, so that means he can't use that as an alibi.
Yeah. But also, I don't think she's trying to lie for him. Like, I think, you know, as things like this, traumatic experiences happen, sometimes you just kind of burn something in your mind. You're thinking about the possibility over and over, and, you know, you can create a false memory. I think she's just trying to be as helpful as she can with all this. Because to your point, Gray, if she wanted to lie and give him an alibi, she could have just lied and given him an alibi. That's not what we have here. As a matter of fact, when the police originally kind of had him in their sights and they wanted a DNA sample, she was going down there saying, give it to him. You know, she was... I
wonder why he did that, why he was so willing to give it. Just to make her not upset? I mean, that's such a strange...
Yeah. Maybe he didn't understand really the whole DNA process, which brings up a point, because I remember thinking at the time, usually when genealogy identifies a suspect and says, this is your likely suspect, you have to go collect their DNA. They don't knock on your door and say, hey, can we have some of your DNA? We think you're a killer. They usually go behind you when you're not paying attention, pick up a cup that you drank out of, pick up a cigarette butt, test your DNA and verify that they've got the right person. Then they come arrest you.
Right.
This was weird. This played out weird because they tipped him off that he's a suspect. We want your DNA. Who knows what could have happened? You know, he could have fled. He could have.
Well, they approached him.
A shootout, something like that.
Yeah, but they approached him under the pretense, because they didn't have an exact. They had it down to his branch.
4 people.
Yeah, it was 4 people basically in his branch of the family, and so their approach with him was because Chief Walker knew him from high school. He was like, "Oh, I know this guy. I'm going to reach out to him and ask and say, hey, I need some help on a case. We know it's one of these 4 people. Coley was one of the people, and he was just the right one that Marlos picked, like off the top. I mean, he got the right guy.
And it's still, I think, a mistake, because who's to say when they knocked on Coley's door, he doesn't start shooting? Who's to say as soon as they leave, they take that DNA, he doesn't pack a bag and take off to Mexico or something. So
right.
I was shocked then that they did this. I think it was a mistake. I think they should have walked behind him, picked up a cigarette butt, picked up a cup he drank out of, verified it was him without ever approaching him, and then arrested him when they made the DNA link.
Right, because as soon as you bring him in, now he's aware.
He's aware. He can cover stuff up. He can get stories changed. He can start thinking about what he's going to say, what he's going to do. Point. But again, you have the aspect of, does he flip out and take cops out with him as he says, I'm not going to face justice? You never know what's going to happen. That's why a lot of times these police, they'll never tell a person that they're trying to collect their DNA. They'll just collect it, compare it, and then arrest them when it's a match.
We also have the benefit of, we're analyzing crimes from all kinds of different areas, all kinds of different departments and their different processes, and starting to see standards like that for sure. Like in most cases, they're following him around. They're watching for him to spit out his chewing gum or pick up a water bottle that he used or something like that. I think this is probably the first use of DNA in this way, in this area, possibly that whole state. So it is a good point, and I do think that we're going to see more lessons like that as we kind of get through these cases, and cases that go this far where we're actually. It's interesting. I with Golden State, they kind of told him what they had, and then basically he rolled to a confession, right? Like, we didn't get to full blown trial.
Yeah, he took a plea deal essentially.
Most of them do that, actually.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Like, this is the first time we've seen one of these kind of genetic genealogy things actually land in court and someone try to fight it. It's just not common.
Yeah. Most of the time they take a plea deal because the evidence is just so overwhelming.
Yeah.
Or they take their chances and they go to trial, and this is what happens.
Yeah, this is what happens. An employee at the Big Little store named Mary Campbell would testify that the girls came into the store around 10:30 and asked for directions, another confirmation that the girls were lost. She left by 11:15, and she doesn't recall seeing McCraney or the girls there. So obviously, prosecution kind of putting together this timeline. We know the phone call. We know the boyfriend that's expecting them around that time. Girls are not at the Big Little anymore, and they don't show up where they're supposed to be next to meet up with those guys. On the fourth day of the trial, we finally had an answer to one of the big questions. Coley McCraney did in fact take the stand to tell his version of events. And he said that there was actually a little more history to his meeting JB. It wasn't quite the simplified version we heard when the defense gave their opening arguments that, oh yeah, he just came across these girls and jumped in their car and a little sweet talk, and that was it. All of a sudden, they were having sex. McCraney said that he met JB, whom he actually called Jennifer, in June of 1999 at the Wiregrass Commons Mall. So that would have been a month before this happened. He was in Dothan to drop his then girlfriend off at work, and he stopped at Radio Shack. He said that JB walked by the store. When he was walking out, he walked up to her and introduced himself, and they struck up a conversation. He gave JB his mother's phone number. He didn't have a phone, and he didn't want JB paging him when his girlfriend was around. McCraney testified that JB called him at his mother's house that same day. Big question for me, and I know we're talking about 20 years ago, so I already know the answer, but are there any phone logs? Like, can we prove that a phone call happened between those two at that point?
It seems like in 1999 you should be able to. Just a call that came in, right?
Yeah.
But they retain them for that long. Even if they did have them at the time, would they still have them?
But shouldn't they have collected that at the time? Who's called these numbers? Who's called this house? Just
I don't know if they would have to get a warrant. If they would have to get a warrant, because it's calling his mom's house, right? He's saying that JB called his mother.
Yeah. Well, you'd think they'd be checking JB's phone to see who she was calling. But again, if she made these calls from a payphone or something, then that sort of goes out the window.
Yeah. This is his chance, right? Like, this is what I've been waiting for literally years. I want to hear his version of events, but I also want to see, do they have evidence to support his version of events? So far, we hear about a phone call that it doesn't seem like there's any proof of. On July 31st, 1999, he said that he got a call from JB saying that she would be in Ozark and he asked if they were going to get together. They made plans to meet at 10 p.m. At the Big Little. So McCraney said he waited for her at the Big Little until after 10. He then went back to his mom's house because that was the only number that JB had, and he was waiting for her phone call, but she never called. He testified that he left around 11:45. He said that his alternator started acting up, and he literally coasted into the parking lot of the Big Little. Guess who's there on the phone? He said he recognized the girls and he talked to both of them. He got into the backside passenger side of the Mazda 929 to show them a shortcut back to Highway 231, and they passed the gas station where his big rig truck was parked. He showed them the truck, and JB got in, and one thing led to another in the bed that's in the compartment in the back of his truck. He said that they only talked for a few minutes because she said she had to meet someone. He asked them to drop him off away from his home so his girlfriend wouldn't see them. McCraney also testified that he didn't tell anyone about a possible relationship with JB. The first person to have heard about that story was his defense attorney, David Harris. He didn't tell anybody his entire life about this encounter.
Well,
what do you
you know,
think?
I can, you know, on one hand, it sounds shady. On the other hand, you know, I don't know the stereotypes in the South, but being a black man in the South in which a young white girl has been murdered, and you were with her, I don't know if I'd want to be running forward with that information either, but not doing that is definitely coming back to haunt him.
But doesn't Coley claim that he's known her for a while?
That he's known her, but as a different name. He didn't know her as JB. He knew her as Jennifer. Right,
of course. And there's a reason for that, I'm sure. But anyways, I mean, it seems like if they'd already seen each other, then maybe he would have told a friend, like, "Hey, man, I met this girl."
I mean,
after the murder, I could see after the murder not saying anything to a soul for a whole bunch of reasons. You know, you don't want your wife to know that you had an affair. Oh my God, I was with her. I didn't want to tell you, but she ended up being murdered. But I wanted to let you know. You're not going to say that. I mean, so there's a whole bunch of reasons why you wouldn't tell anybody after the murders, but prior, why wouldn't you tell some of your friends?
Yeah. Harrison asked why he didn't tell investigators that he knew the girls. He said that he was scared and that once they put the handcuffs on him, he figured they had already made up their minds. Harrison asked him if McCraney raped Miss Beasley. He said no. He asked if he murdered Ms. Beasley. McCraney said no. He asked if he murdered Tracy Hollett. McCraney said, no, I did not. He stated that he had a truck driving gig after that weekend, and he didn't hear about the case until about 3 weeks later when his girlfriend told him about it, but he didn't know it was the girl that he was with because everyone just referred to them as the two girls. Plus, he called JB Jennifer.
And see, he thought through that part. See, that's the thing, is like he was thinking, wow, JB is pretty unusual. Yeah, so I got to come up with some. Oh, yeah, it's Jennifer. And that's why it just didn't ring a bell at all. Yeah. Even though the picture's out there, and I know exactly what she looks like.
In that area, in that community, that had to be big news. So he would have had to see this picture on TV at some point or in the paper.
Yeah. And
say, oh, my gosh, that's the Jennifer that I know. Right. Maybe I better come forward and share what I know, but he didn't do that. So that makes him look, you know.
We know how these news cycles work. Every year on the anniversary, there was another touch on the story. Oh, we haven't found him yet. We haven't found him yet. But you know, he's got this story weaved together. Plus he's a truck driver. He's gone for weeks at a time.
So he never called JB's mom like he did that one time to say, hey, is JB around?
No, he didn't have JB's mom's. It was reverse. He gave his mom's number to JB.
Oh, I see.
Yeah. But that is interesting. He had no way to contact her. What's also interesting is you say that you have this type of encounter. You have a sexual encounter. You don't try to like reach back out. Hey, that was fun. We should hang out sometime. Like no follow up at all. Were you even hoping to see her again? Like just all the normal things that might happen after an encounter like that.
But that version of the story allows him to not be able to contact her.
Yeah.
See, you
it
tell that,
separates
you know,
him from her for the rest
Yeah.
of the time, and he has an excuse for not being in contact with her.
Yeah. Well, I asked Ken Curtis, the reporter, who he thought was the least reliable witness, and he told me Coley McCraney. He said that his testimony had holes in it and it just never resonated with jurors. Historiented agrees, telling me the narrative he gave was simply absurd, way too many holes and absurdities in his narrative. He also said that when McCraney was cross-examined and plainly asked if he was in the car, and all McCraney could say was yes, that he believes that was a big, strong moment that really shifted the jury. I mean, basically.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
He's placing himself in their car. He's placing his DNA on her. He's confirming this. What else, what other direction is there for a jury to go with this?
Yeah. Plus this time frame and opportunity, right? We're talking about an area. This isn't downtown LA or downtown New York
with thousands of people.
Right. Like if these girls are out 11 o'clock at night in that type of area, how many people are they going to come across? And you have to believe, oh, there was one guy and, I had sex with him. We went and dropped him off. And then we ran into a bad guy.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's such a miracle.
A quarter mile down the road, there was a killer hiding.
Yeah.
Doesn't sound believable. And I think normally it's not a good idea to take the stand. I think he had to take the stand and give some kind of account of why his DNA is there.
Yeah.
Because if not, if he doesn't say anything, he doesn't take the stand, they're going to paint the narrative for him of why his DNA is there. I mean, it's pretty weak, the story that he gives, but at the same time, he's trying to explain it away.
It's an important choice to take the stand or not. And for this one, with that story, I don't know. And I'm not the only one that thinks maybe it wasn't the best choice. Ken Curtis would write in an article, McCraney's testimony did not play out well and likely proved to be detrimental to the defense. McCraney may have dug a deeper hole when he testified he did not know until his 2019 arrest that Beasley died.
That's insane. Pure insanity.
Yeah. I don't believe it.
Prosecutors would take everyone through McCraney's timeline again, noting what an amazing coincidence it was that his car broke down at the gas station when the girls just happened to be there. I guess so, McCraney replied.
But didn't he say he was going to meet her there that night?
Yeah, but not at that time. He was supposed to meet her at 10. And
then
he left.
Then he meets her by accident at a different time there.
Yeah, so his car breaks down where he was supposed to meet her randomly. Come on, give me a break.
Yeah. They also pointed out the strange action of showing someone a shortcut. His story is he was going to show them a shortcut back home, but then they needed to take him home first. So you show them the shortcut, they turn around, go drop you off, and then they try to go back to the shortcut.
Yeah. Make any sense?
Doesn't sound legit.
No. McCraney says that they got in his truck around midnight with Tracy staying in the car. And by 12:05, JB was basically in the bed of his truck with him. A woman that he had only met once before, even by this news story where he knew her from the month prior. We're talking about he met her at the Radio Shack, talked to her on the phone, I think twice. And he says that they were leaving by 12:15 because they had finished and JB said that she was in a rush. Attorney General Marshall pointed out he meets the girls, has sex with one of them, and returns home in 48 minutes. He also points out that only 3 people know if McCraney committed murder or not, and that is McCraney, JB, and Tracy. The defense said in their opening statements that a paperboy would bring the news, and they brought up Dan Driver to the stand. He picked up his papers around 1 a.m. to deliver them, and says on that night that he saw a Mazda 929 with its emergency lights on at James Street and Herring Avenue around 2:15 a.m. The second time he saw the car, there was another vehicle, a Mercury Grand Marquis, that stopped behind the 929. He stated that he believed it was an undercover police car because it had strobe lights on it. Around 2:45, he saw the car again with an Ozark Police Department car, and the police car's passenger's side door was open. And he testified he saw it again around 7 a.m. So it sounds like Dan thinks that the police are interacting with the car well before they're supposed to know about this, because they're not notified about the car until the following morning, kind of based on the official story. The witness also claimed that it was raining that night, but the weather reports from July 31st showed that it was not raining.
So at that time, the police, even if this was a police car behind there, they didn't know there was a missing person, an endangered person.
Right.
So it's not like they're going to just rip the trunk open and say, "Is there a body in here?" So
Yeah, it's a possibility. It's a possibility that the police could have stopped there and noticed the car. I don't see anything.
but is there a record of it though? Have police ever confirmed that they did stop there and
Yeah,
fill out an incident report, check it out, call it in, anything?
I don't believe so, but we've got something here that might explain this a little bit. Historiented told me that Dan Driver was probably the defense's best witness, but there was a big issue that came out during his testimony. Driver, prior to 2019, had been in a vicious accident where he fell 20 feet from an excavator, hitting his head on a rock. For a period of time, he couldn't even remember his own children's names. So his memory could be severely impaired.
Plus, you mentioned it wasn't raining that night, so he thought it was. I mean, there's people that sometimes insert themselves into cases and have a story to tell.
But I would ask this. When did he originally come forward and document this? Was it before his head injury?
He's saying that he tried to reach out to police 20 years ago. In the opening statements, the defense said that report has somehow disappeared.
So was there a report? Or there was never a report? We don't really know if there was a report.
We don't really know.
Okay.
Yeah. The other thing, there was another witness they brought up that lives close to there, who says he saw the car. The guy that I was talking about earlier that saw the tan truck with the car. He has a balcony that kind of overlooks that direction. He knew what car it was because he has one. He has a 929, and he's like, I think I'm the only person in town that has one. So it really stood out to me, like, oh, there's a 929 out down there. Is it a possibility that the paperboy was actually seeing that guy's 929 at different places or on a different night or something like that? I don't know.
Interesting.
So closing arguments were presented for the prosecution by Jimmy Thomas with the Alabama Attorney General's office, who again reaffirmed what they believed happened, that McCraney was responsible, and, quote, "It is clear that this defendant shot those girls because he did not want to be held accountable for raping JB." He knocked the credibility of the defense's witnesses, including another mention of Dan Driver's brain injury and that it had affected his memory. And he also asked a very good question when theorizing about a potential third party being the culprit. Why would a third person want to kill those girls? Why would a third person need to move the car after killing them? Kind of to your point earlier. And that throws us back into where we started this thing 4 years ago. All of a sudden, you're trying to tell us you have no motive for this killing. Their items, of value were left behind. If the sexual encounter was a legit sexual encounter, that's not part of the motive. They were killed for absolutely no reason.
Which we know, is unlikely. They were killed for some reason.
Yeah,
it just doesn't add up.
I mean, I remember discussing at one point that maybe it was some sort of person that didn't like the fact that Coley McCraney was black and JB Beasley was white and took revenge out on them, but that's such a far-fetched sort of situation,
and I remember stories. I mean, I'm kind of surprised that the defense actually didn't lean into the stories on, law enforcement more, because the rumor mill, when it came to law enforcement being involved in this, was already crazy back then, and kind of public perception of law enforcement over the past few years, not the best. So I'm kind of surprised they didn't lean that way more.
Especially because the rumor mill, remember how many different reports we had and rumors that were swirling around that JB was dating a cop of some sort.
Yes. And
she could have been killed to silence her over it.
Right. And had tape. They were trying to use tape of the cop that was, it was something like the cop doing a drug deal or something like that. And they were using the tape to help out a friend of theirs. Like, the rumor mill around police involvement on this was nuts. It was really
and then
nuts.
Look how simple it sort of is in a way,
Honestly. Yeah, this is. Thomas said that when you consider all of the evidence presented, quote, "the pieces of the puzzle make a whole picture. In this case, you don't have to actually see this defendant shoot and kill JB and Tracy to know what he did. In this case, there are only two people who could tell you exactly what happened, and this defendant made sure that they were not around to tell you." Ken Curtis told me that the closing argument is something that he'll never forget. Quote, the attorney general basically tore McCraney's timeline of the night to pieces. David Harrison gave closing arguments for the defense and kept on his track by saying, where is the evidence? Where is the evidence? Where is the evidence? He noted that there were 5 expert witnesses brought up by the prosecution, and none of them said that they had evidence to prove McCraney killed those girls. Harrison pulled out a board, and on the board it was written, no confession, no motive, no fingerprints, no rape, no gun, no video, no audio, no crime scene, plus eyewitness alibi equals not guilty. Harrison said that the, quote, elephant in the room is that white girls and black boys hook up. He also stated DNA stands for do not assume. He then asked, what happens when we assume? He ended by reminding the jury that if there was reasonable doubt, they must acquit McCraney. In the prosecution's rebuttal, they pointed out that the defense simply couldn't explain the DNA evidence in a way that made sense. He pointed out that the mud tells a story and, quote, not the story of sex in the bed of a truck, but a girl's on the ground being raped by somebody she doesn't know. And with that, the jury was sent back for deliberation. They deliberated for about a day, and they did come back with a verdict. I know Ken Curtis was really concerned that this would go to a hung jury, and then we'd have to put the families through all this again. Coley McCraney was found guilty on 2 counts of capital murder vehicle, guilty on 1 count of capital murder rape, and guilty of capital murder of 2 or more persons. And in what you might imagine is the most dramatic part of the trial, the verdict being read, both Ken and Historiented tell me that the courtroom basically fell silent. They could hear a few whimpers from the defense's side of the room. Ken saw Jeanette McCraney crying in a stairwell as he walked out to film a live update for TV. This case that has hurt and divided a community for so many years finally reached its conclusion. Well, almost. The jury has 2 options for punishment, and that is life without parole or execution.
Yeah. I actually thought that there was a good chance of it being a hung jury given the conspiratorial anti-cop nature of the area.
Yeah.
I thought there would be some holdout in there. I was absolutely pleasantly surprised that they came back with a guilty on all counts, and I think it's absolutely the right decision. It makes the story that he tried to tell makes absolutely no sense at all.
Yep. Morph?
I come back to, I get why I think he needed to try and explain why his DNA was found there. And again, you went through a list of why that was a bad idea. But at the same time, if he didn't have an explanation for why the DNA was there, the prosecution would just make, say this is what happened, and they would document their story of how things unfolded, and the end result might be the same thing. He might be found guilty, but I think in this case, based on everything we see, I think they got the right guy. I mean, he's placing himself in the car. He's placing his DNA places him there. Never told anyone about it. Never came forward sooner to say, hey, years ago this happened, and I saw a story on the news, and I realized that I knew them, and and I think, again, we had a lot of people reach out who supported McCraney, saying they got the wrong guy, he didn't do it. And I think part of it's probably because what's the motive? He doesn't have a criminal record. How could he have done this? And as we see a lot, these kinds of crimes happen one time and the person never does it again. That's a fact. So he could have gone on to live a normal life and been productive. And you mentioned he was a pastor. And this one time this happened. And it's shocking, and there's no resolution, and people will be scratching their heads asking why. And, unless he comes clean and shares more information, you're probably never going to know.
Yeah. As far as how the community is taking this, Ken tells me that there's a group of peaceful protesters outside the courthouse. They're holding up signs that say Coley strong, on the belief that he is actually innocent. Historiented tells me that the online buzz is still conflicted, with some people claiming that the court got it wrong, but thankfully the disagreements are pretty respectful in nature. The biggest relief in my mind is for the families of those two girls that have been saddled with this search for justice for so long, but of course this doesn't make those losses go away. During their victim impact statements, Tracy's mother, Carol Roberts, said, "I think the hardest thing that we've gone through is holidays with an empty chair that Tracy should have been in. I think I was blessed from having Tracy for 17 years. I learned a lot from her." J.B. Beasley's mother, Cheryl Burgoon, told jurors, "I have a hole inside of me. I hurt so bad. It's not something you get over. I exist without her." Several friends and family of Coley McCraney also took to the stand, speaking of the peaceful, godly man that they all knew. One even noted that a life in prison could give McCraney the opportunity to help others. Harvey McLeod, supervisor at Dale County Jail, said of McCraney, "One of the best inmates we've had, if not the best." He also detailed how McCraney has Bible classes in the jail, helping other inmates find God. Of course,
This is, yeah. Okay. Sorry about that.
No,
You
sorry.
still continue. I think this is one of those cases that, even though death, if you could had way better evidence, I would do the death penalty in this one for what he did. But it's one of those cases where I put it in the life without parole because, there's a 1 in a billion chance that he's telling the truth. But they're really, I mean, I have this opinion now because I donate money to the Innocence Project, and you see these cases out there that these people got sentenced to death, they're on death row, and then DNA clears them. Okay, this isn't going to, it's a complete opposite here, but it's one of those things where, is there enough where you'd say, let's give them the death penalty?
Right.
I don't know.
I think it also comes down to premeditation and, the overall crime, what was done leading up to it. I think all that comes into play too, as to whether it gets an actual death penalty sentence.
I mean, it seems like an killing of opportunity, doesn't it?
It does.
Like he was just happened to be at the store. I wonder if there's a real story where he went there to go get something.
Well, I think the prosecutors have it right. I think it started as a sexual assault, and then he was like, "What now?"
Yeah.
And we've got this witness. Like, he knew he was going to jail at that point if those two girls survived. And
Do you think maybe he was following them around prior and just pulled up behind them? I mean, it seems
no, because he's got to
random.
stop. He's got to stop where he's with his family. He went over to his mother's house for a bit and literally hung out with family, and then left and was heading home when supposedly he came across the gas station and the two girls.
But that's a story that's being told, right?
Yeah.
I'm curious if anybody, and maybe this came up trial, maybe it didn't. I'm curious if anybody from back in the era remembered him using guns, shooting guns, owning guns.
Yeah, none of
because
that came
we know
out.
the gun was not found. We know that. But does he have a history? If somebody said, "Oh yeah, he carried guns with him,"
former law enforcement, or not law enforcement, former Air Force, if I recall correctly.
Yeah, don't you remember that? That was on an Air Force base. He had a weird incident.
Yeah. He had an incident where he held a teenager and like kept them in their room or something like that, and then that wound up being almost like a kidnapping charge.
So there is some history then.
Yeah, but not basically after he left the Air Force, there was just no criminal.
But why
history.
didn't that make it to trial? That little maybe because it's not related. Maybe
that seems like it would be admissible though. If you've got a history of detaining somebody against their will, especially if it involves a gun, that's information that the jury has a right to know.
Yep. Of course, during the victim impact statements, his wife, Jeanette, also spoke up. She said, "He's a good man. His children need him. I need him. My heart goes out to that family. I hate what they're going through, but our family, we need him. I love you, Coley." Now, in some states, you can be sentenced to death and essentially it just never happens. And that person just remains in jail forever. But according to Wikipedia, Alabama has the highest per capita capital sentencing rate in the United States. In some years, its courts impose more death sentences than Texas, a state that has a population 5 times as large. However, Texas has a higher rate of executions. When the prosecution seeks the death penalty, the sentence is decided by the jury, and at least 10 jurors must concur. So that's what's got to happen here. Basically, as of when we're filming this, I just did a quick check on the news feeds. They're not going to do this sentencing until the morning of April 28th, when this video is being released. So we're not exactly sure which way this is going to fall.
What do you think about it? What's your? I mean, if you could choose,
I honestly, I'm not the biggest proponent of the death penalty. I understand, and I've heard from families that have gone through these terrible situations that they weren't either until they were literally in that situation, and it changed how they saw the world. So I totally understand that. But to your point, with the type of evidence that we have in this case, if it was, we found the gun, his DNA is on the gun, like that's a bit of a different thing. The reason why I gave so much pause to really letting my needle move too far in either direction was because of that, the location of the DNA and the fact that there could have been a reasonable explanation for it. I think that's what I was waiting for this trial for. And that explanation, when it came out, didn't seem so reasonable anymore. And at this point, I do feel like they got the right guy. But to your point, Gray, and I've watched a lot of different things happen with the Innocence Project as well. I don't think this is that type of case.
Right. That the DNA is his.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's not one of those, right?
Yeah.
I feel like, the jury came to a conclusion of guilty. He's either innocent or guilty. If he's guilty, you hand out the appropriate punishment that you think is appropriate. And again, that's for the jury to decide what that is. But I definitely understand what you guys are saying about if this was a slam dunk, there's a witness, plus there's DNA on the gun, plus if it was just overwhelmingly, but on the 1 in a million chance that he's telling the truth, I could see keeping that option open for him to, in the future, somehow prove his innocence.
Like, I think that definitely, not to get into the whole thing, should be more rare, like where there is no doubt, like not a reasonable doubt, there is no doubt. Like, this person is the killer because we've got this, and this. Those are the ones that get executed.
And I look at a little bit of, sometimes people are hypocritical. If he really did do it and he's really a spiritual person and a man of God like he claims to be, he should own it and say, I committed a terrible act.
I thought about that too, Mike. I was feeling the same way. Like,
That's a good point.
if this would have not gone to trial, basically, and he would have said, you guys found me. Look, I've tried to change. Like this could have been a very, very different thing. And quite honestly, I don't know that the death penalty would be on the table if that's the approach that was kind of used. It might be. I don't know. But in terms of being a man of God and really showing that you've been reformed in some way, that would have meant a lot.
Well, he could have said, look, I'll tell you everything that happened, take the death penalty off the table.
Yeah.
And that could have been that. They probably would have accepted that. Yeah.
And they actually did. They filed a motion trying to get the death penalty off the table a month or two ago. And basically it was squashed. So, well, as of when you guys are seeing this, you could look it up online and see how it actually shook out. I'm certainly going to be checking the news feeds first thing tomorrow morning as well. Anything you guys want to say before we sign off here?
Well, it was cool seeing you guys again.
Yeah, definitely.
Sorry, I'm not feeling well. My brain's kind of fuzzy, but good seeing you.
I can't believe it's been almost 4 years since we took this case on. And
that's crazy.
Here we are finally with some kind of resolution all this time later.
It's a weird feeling. It's not often that we get this. Like, this thing has come full circle. This thing is like done. It's a case we can actually put down. It doesn't happen a whole lot.
Although, it happened to us twice, though, right? Remember?
Yeah.
Allison Watterson. She was found at the same right during the show again.
Yeah.
Well, and we have movement on another case too, John.
Yeah,
we do. And if you're wondering what's going on with the case that we covered in season 2, the death of Elisa Gomez, an official investigation was reopened late last year. I literally had kind of a big meeting with our county attorneys here this past week. And I was, of course, was there with Elisa's family, and John Bishop was with us as well. That's about all I could say right now. I'm just keeping my fingers crossed that maybe you're going to see the three of us together again with an update on that case at some point in the future.
And that's a case that was just from the beginning. I think we were all on the same page, and
yeah,
what was glaringly obvious to us
yeah,
wasn't so obvious to the powers that be, but we'll see where that goes.
It's probably the biggest uphill push that I've seen on a case yet, that at least has gotten some form of momentum, something kind of rolling on it. So yeah, fingers crossed that we keep seeing some good progress.
That's awesome.
On that.
And good job. I know you've really been on that one and working with the family and getting the word out there.
It means so much to me just to be there for them through that stuff. Like wherever this lands, I'm just trying to appreciate being there for them in those tough moments and giving them a shoulder to lean on. So yeah, absolutely.
I hope they get a good outcome.
I do too. Of course, we couldn't have done any of this coverage today without the amazing people, Ken Curtis and Cassidy Lee with WTVY. They were basically posting updates from the courtroom to a page. I'd sent links to both Morph and Gray so we can kind of keep up on it as it was happening. They just had really amazing coverage of the trial. On top of that, they put out a 23-minute documentary produced by Local News 4. I helped out with that. I'll have a link to that in the description box down below if you want to check that out. If you want to roll back and see season 1, it's still here on YouTube. I'll have a link to that playlist in the description box below. And they're also running it on the Roku channel's new true crime destination, Mysteria. Just go to the live TV in Roku channel, look for channel 548, Mysteria, and you might bump into 3 Men and a Mystery there as well. And with that, I'm John Lorden.
I'm Gray Hughes.
I'm Mike Morford.
And we are 3 Men and a Mystery. Mystery solved.
Boom.